Well, as you know, today is Next Gen Sunday, and this is where we allow our students and our children to take over the service. And haven't they done a great job so far? Yes, it's one of our favorite times of the year. And I do want to wish you a happy Labor Day weekend as well. Thank you for being here in the house of God on Labor Day weekend. We're so excited that you chose to join us here today. We're going to continue in Next Gen Sunday with our 5 on 5. Now, if you've never heard of the 5 on 5, it is so cool and you're in for a treat. It's where 5 young communicators come together to bring one cohesive message, and they're young adults and students that are here at Anchor Bend. And so they have been preparing. They've spent weeks pulling their messages together, practicing and crafting them, and today they're going to deliver them to you. Are you guys excited? Yes. Before I introduce them, just one reminder that this Wednesday we have First Wednesday service here at Anchor Bend. So we want to invite you to join us 7 p.m. We have full children's department open. Bring your family. We'll have extended worship. We'll hear a word, have some altar ministry moments. And so invite a friend, invite a family member, and join us this Wednesday for First Wednesday. Well, I'm really honored and excited to introduce our speakers to you today. I'm going to call them out and introduce them, and they'll join us here on stage. First, we have Alexis Alamia. Yes. Chad Reed. Jeremiah Ramirez. Alexandra Reed. And Caden Kyles. Yes, and like I said, they have spent the last few weeks preparing, prepping their messages, delivering their messages, and they're really excited to bring this word to you. A couple things before we dive in. The first is, just so you know, each of them has 6 minutes to deliver their message. So what this means is that they're not going to come up and introduce themselves. They're also not going to honor Pastor Jim and Pastor Phyllis. We know how much they honor and love them, and so they're going to come up to the podium and dive right into their message and deliver what God has placed on their hearts. If you haven't already, you can pull out your message notes. You have a sheet that was provided when you walked in, or if you want to pull out your mobile app, Anchor Bend Church, you can use that as well to take notes. There's some really powerful nuggets in today's message that you'll want to write down. And the last is what we ask every 6 on 6, every 5 on 5, that you would engage, that you would shout down our speakers, that you would hype them up, that you would laugh, that you would encourage them as they are speaking. It's going to be a lot of fun. Are you guys ready for 5 on 5? Yes. All right. Without further ado, I'm welcoming Caden Kyles.
What's up? So today, if I had to title my message, it would be Obedience is Better Than Sacrifice. It comes from the passage of 1 Samuel 15:22. In this scripture, we find Saul as the anointed king of Israel. And Samuel, who is the prophet of the Lord, he counseled a lot of the kings in Israel. And he told Saul that God said it was time to go to war and destroy the Amalekite nation. Through Samuel, God instructed Saul to kill all the animals of the Amalekites and leave nobody alive. He also told Saul to wait for Samuel, so after the war was over, he could come and offer a sacrifice to the Lord. I mean, as I was reading that, I was like, wow, like that's a little intense. But I mean, I guess that's just how they used to roll in the Old Testament. But so Saul went off to war as Samuel had told him, and he defeated the Amalekite nation. However, instead of destroying everything like he was supposed to, he only destroyed everything that was of little value. And he kept everything else. He kept the healthy animals and even spared the king. Saul was supposed to wait for Samuel to get there so Samuel could offer a sacrifice to the Lord. But after the battle, Samuel was walking a little slower. He didn't have as much pep in his step, so everybody started to get anxious, and they started to be impatient, and people started leaving. And so Saul became impatient. And so he decided to take it upon himself and offer the sacrifice to the Lord. And so whenever Samuel got there, Samuel was upset because he clearly disobeyed exactly what the Lord had said. And so this is what the scripture says. It says, "What is more pleasing to the Lord, your burnt offerings and sacrifices, or your obedience to his voice?" listen, obedience is better than sacrifice. And this scripture really spoke to me, and whenever I was reading it, I realized that even though the Lord loves our worship, he loves our obedience more. So at the end of my 10th grade year, going into my 11th grade year, I was coming off my second year of high school football, and the Lord asked me to do something that required me to obey. And I was starting linebacker on the football team. I had a lot of friends. I was close with a lot of coaches, and even a lot of the coaches had coached my cousins throughout high school. So I felt like there was a lot of pressure on me that I needed to perform, and I needed to be as best as I possibly could for this upcoming football season. In this season, football defined who I was. It was everything to me. It's what I found my identity in, my security in. And then the Lord decided he wanted to pull that rug right out from under me. And before I started my junior year of high school, the Lord began to challenge me, and he opened my eyes and made me realize that not only had I made football my everything, I had made it my identity. It stood in place of my relationship with him. And one thing I want to say is there's nothing wrong with football. It was just in that season, football had become a distraction from what the Lord had called me to do. And I was honestly hoping for the Lord to give me a different option. I was hoping for him to give me a second way out. But he did not give that to me. And this is one of those times where I tried to make excuses and reasons why, or reasons to not listen to the Lord. And even though I knew exactly what the Lord was asking me to do, and I knew it was the Lord speaking to me. So sometimes God just whispers, and I was hoping that he was going to whisper to me, but in this instance, I felt like he was clearly yelling at me. And I knew it was time for me to give up football, and it was a hard decision. I had based my entire life around it. What was my friends on the football team going to say about me? What were the coaches going to think about me? What was going to be said about me in the school and outside of school? And so I was really starting to feel a lot of weight and pressure, and not only that, I only had 2 weeks until school started, and I still had not made a decision. The only thing I could do in the midst of all of this was pray. I knew the only way I would be able to take this step is if the Lord gave me the grace and strength to do that, and the only way he could is if I prayed and asked him for it. And not only that, he surrounded me with wise counsel from my parents and other people in the church and other leaders that are in my life. And I can guarantee you that is the only way I was able to have those hard conversations with the coaches and my friends that were coming up to me in school and asking, why aren't you playing this year? Why aren't you doing this? Why aren't you doing that? That is the only way. And this brings me to my key point. Obedience brings God's blessing. In Isaiah 1:19, it says, if you are willing and obedient, you will eat the best of the land. And this is God's promise to the Israelites, but this is also his promise to us today. Here's what God did for me. When I obeyed him, it was tough. I didn't know if it was the right decision, and honestly, I even doubted if it was God for a while, because I was like, why are you going to tell me to give up something that I love? But God was faithful. Because I obeyed, he started opening a lot of doors, many doors, and opportunities in my life. He allowed me to be more involved in the church and serve in our children's department. And he also allowed me to pursue my passion and be more involved with the organization, a Christian hunting and fishing organization called CTO, and take kids and minister to them and pour into them. And not only that, he allowed me to start my own business and my entrepreneurial journey that's tied to my passion. I mean, that's a God thing if I don't know what is. And I feel like had I not obeyed and been obedient to the Lord, I would not have had the amazing opportunities and doors opened into my life. When you obey the Lord, his blessings are able to follow your life. One question I have, and I want some of y'all to think on, is what are some areas in your life that the Lord may be asking you to obey in? Maybe he's asking you to take a little bit of time and set aside throughout the week to join a small group. Or maybe he's asking you to give up a certain group of friends or certain people in your life or certain things so that he can start working in and through your life. One thing I want you to remember, if you remember anything at all from this, is when you obey the Lord, your obedience brings his blessing. Thank you.
Today, I'm talking about when God's promise doesn't come as expected. How many of you in here are control freaks? always wanting things to go your way all of the time. Welcome to the club. I'm a control freak. Not only do you like it done our way, we're also the ones who complain the most about everything all the time, and will be the pickiest person in the restaurant. You often find us modifying every order on the menu and asking the server if they can make an exception. We'll do all this and still find ourselves complaining when one little thing goes wrong. I actually have a pretty funny experience of a time I received something, but not how I envisioned it. So this past summer, I was a lifeguard in this outrageous Texas heat, and for reference, I was on hour 7 of an 11-hour shift. And let's just say your girl was a little bit hangry. So I ended up ordering McDonald's off of DoorDash. How many of you have ordered something off of DoorDash and are grateful for DoorDash? Yeah. I ended up ordering a plain bacon McDouble and a caramel frappuccino, extra whip, extra caramel. You know you have to be specific and say the extra things because sometimes they're a little frugal, so you got to specify what you want. So I ordered my meal, and it says the delivery time would be an hour. Now, an hour for DoorDash McDonald's is a little excessive. But at this point in time, I was still remembering that I know who Jesus was. So I was giving them a little bit of grace with it. So I wait my full hour, and I finally get the message that my dasher had arrived. And I basically skipped to meet her at her car, and everything was so great. She hands me my sealed bag with my burger, and I'm so happy until she starts to roll up her window and put her car in drive. And it was at this moment that panic started to settle in my heart. I go, "Excuse me, ma'am, where's my caramel frappuccino, extra whip, extra caramel?" She looked at me like I was crazy. She goes, "What drink?" It was like a switch flipped in me. This lady really forgot my caramel frappuccino, extra whip, extra caramel. And let's just say my attitude towards her during this part of the interaction was not the greatest. But you know the whole "you're not you when you're hungry" Snickers commercial? This is my story of my life. That was me. So there she was, calling the store, trying to locate my drink and be helpful. But I was just not having it. I actually ended up walking away from this lady mid-conversation, going into the gates and sitting down, preparing to sadly eat my burger without my frappuccino. But you know how DoorDash will seal their bags and it'll say "sealed for your protection and safety"? That was the boat that I was in. So I rip open the seal and open the bag, and inside the bag is actually my caramel frappuccino, extra whip, extra, extra caramel. And there I was, jumping to conclusions, unsatisfied with my order. But in reality, I received exactly what I ordered, just packaged differently than the way I expected. But I wonder if some of us use the same mindset when God answers our prayers, but in a different way than we thought he would. Maybe someone did actually mess up your order, for real. Or you didn't get the job you've been praying for, but you ended up with the job that God knew that you needed. Sometimes doors will shut unexpectedly, and we're left feeling confused and actually angry with God. It reminds me of a story in the Bible about a man named Balaam, who was on a mission to deliver God's words to God's people on a donkey. But on this journey, things did not go as expected. This story can be found in Numbers 22, verses 26 through 31. It says, "The angel of the Lord moved on ahead and stood in a narrow place where there was no room to turn left, either to the right or to the left. When the donkey saw the angel of the Lord, it lay down under Balaam. So while Balaam was on this journey, he was riding on his donkey, and the donkey saw something in the road and basically paused on the road to protect him. So the story continues on, and it says that he was angry and beat it with his staff. Then the Lord opened the donkey's mouth. I don't know about you, but if a donkey started to speak to me, I would be completely shook. But the donkey says, "What have I done to make you beat me these 3 times?" Balaam actually goes on to answer the donkey. He talks back and answers the donkey. He says, "You have made a fool of me," like Balaam. "I think you did that on your own. You started talking back to the donkey. I think you did that on your own. You made a fool of yourself. You have made a fool of me. If I had a sword in my hand, I would kill you right now." Then the donkey says to Balaam, "I am not your own donkey, which you have always ridden to this day. I have been in a habit of doing this to you." "No," he said. Then the Lord opened Balaam's eyes, and he saw the angel of the Lord standing in the road with his sword drawn. So he bowed low and fell face down. You see, Balaam was furious with the donkey for delaying his journey. But in reality, the donkey saw something placed in the path to protect him. If he had continued the journey not on God's timing, he would have actually died. And today, I'm wondering, how many of us are like Balaam, treating all of God's answered prayers like how he treated the donkey? Angry and irritated, beating the very thing sent from God to help us. So maybe you're hearing me say this and you're wondering, how can I stay positive when God's promise doesn't come as expected? Well, today I'm going to leave you with two things. Number one, never criticize God's promise because of how he delivered it. God's methods aren't for us to understand all the time. Sometimes he'll do something and throw something at you, and it'll have you being like, God, I thought we were like this. How could you do this to me, God? How could you? How could you? But sometimes God will send trials to better us, not just to test us. So we should never criticize God's blessings because of how he delivered it. And two, look for the light in all situations and remember to trust that God is always working in our favor. Thank you.
Today I'm talking about being obedient even when you feel unqualified. Has there ever been a time where you knew God was calling you to do something, but you allowed shame and regret to hold you back? Well, I'm here to tell you that you are not alone. In fact, in the Bible, there are many giants of the faith that have felt the same way, including Peter, one of Jesus' closest disciples. Peter followed, assisted, and traveled with Jesus and would help Jesus spread the gospel. But Peter's journey was still filled with ups and downs, especially when Jesus was arrested and went to the cross. During that time, Peter would go on to deny Jesus 3 times. Not one, but 3 times. Now, can you imagine the amount of shame Peter must have felt after denying Jesus? I don't know about any of y'all, but I know that if I were to deny Jesus like that, I would feel like that's something I just couldn't come back from. Okay. Well, just like, think of a time where you felt shame for your actions and felt like you didn't deserve forgiveness. Maybe you lied to someone that you love and betrayed their trust. Or maybe you said something really hurtful to a close friend or family member, and instead of apologizing, you felt like because of what you said, they just wouldn't forgive you anyway. Well, just like you, Peter felt the same way. You see, after denying Jesus, Peter instantly was filled with shame and felt unworthy to be used by God. Has anyone else ever felt this way? There is hope, because Peter's journey did not end there. Instead of Peter letting his past mistakes define him, he would stay obedient to Jesus by repenting and recommitting himself to follow Jesus. Peter had a calling past his shame. Before Jesus' death, in Matthew chapter 16, verse 18, he told Peter that he would be the rock on which Jesus would build his church. In John chapter 21, verses 15 through 19, after his resurrection, Jesus would return to his disciples and ask Peter 3 times, "Do you love me? If so, feed my sheep." Peter would go on to affirm his love for Jesus all 3 times. Through this interaction with Peter, Jesus reestablished that Peter was still called and still chosen to move the mission on spreading the gospel forward. Just like Peter, I too have known the sting of shame and regret. I grew up in church, and I knew who Jesus was and what he had done for me. But in my later years in high school, I would start running from the Lord. And at first, it just seemed harmless because I would tell myself that I was a kid having fun. Years would go by, and the life I was continuing to live led to me feeling hopeless and empty. You see, I knew the truth, and I knew that Jesus was the answer to all of my problems. But since I was living a life of full rebellion, I felt undeserving of God's grace. Despite that feeling, at the beginning of this year, I made the powerful decision to give my life back to Jesus. It started with just going to church every Sunday, and I remember being filled with conviction during those church services. Like, have you ever had a moment of reflection where you just want to cry out to God and say, "Man, God, I'm so sorry"? That's what it was like for me. And after committing to go to church every Sunday, I felt ready to continue my journey of falling in love with Jesus. So in February, I got baptized, and I joined a men's small group. Where are all my men of truth at? Actually, today, you all have that same opportunity. I want to encourage you after service to go out there and join and sign up for a small group, because there truly is freedom in building those relationships. And after going to my small group and attending it, a few months would pass, and I remember tuning into a Wednesday night service and hearing Pastor Jim say that God was going to start calling some of us off the bench. And I remember him saying that even if you don't know what you should do, that it is easier for God to steer a moving car rather than a parked one. So I began to pray and ask God to show me what he wanted me to do. And I remember asking God to show me, to show me in a way that I can't deny. Like, don't show me in a dream. Don't show me in a sign. If you're going to show me, show me. That very next day, I was at work, and I'd gotten a text from Pastor Alexis basically saying that seeing my life completely changed has been inspiring, and she wanted to know if I'd be interested in joining the Anchor Bend youth team. And I literally remember thinking, God, you move quick. But it was crazy to me that even after all the victories I saw in my life this year, I still felt unqualified for this role. So I would wrestle with God all day about it, but I knew that saying yes to this opportunity is what God wanted me to do, and that's exactly what I did. Being a part of the youth team is such a privilege. This summer, we had small groups all around Richmond and Rosenberg called city groups, and this gave me the opportunity to guide and support the youth on their own walk with God. And it's so fulfilling seeing these students absolutely on fire for God. It hasn't been easy, but it's been a life-changing journey of redemption and spiritual growth. Just like Peter, I chose to be obedient and embrace my calling. I want you to know that the enemy will use our shame to try and disqualify us from God's love and forgiveness. But let me make this clear. It is not about how many times that you mess up and fall short, but it's about how many times you get up and keep going. In Acts chapter 2, Peter would go on to address the crowd in Jerusalem on the day of Pentecost, and about 3,000 people were saved that day. Peter's story should remind us that God's love and forgiveness is greater than any mistakes that we've made. Obedience to God requires a willingness to step out in faith even when we feel unqualified. In 2 Corinthians chapter 3, verse 5, it says, "It's not that we think we are qualified to do anything on our own. Our qualification comes from God." So let's rise above shame, embrace obedience, and allow God's grace to transform our past into a testimony. Thank you.
Today I'm talking about bold obedience. And I want to start off with a question. Has there ever been a time where you tried to do something hard and you just quit? I know I have. Just recently, I was asked to join the swim team. And for the first week of practice, everything was going great. And I started to think, wow, this really isn't that bad. Then comes along week 2. The coach decided to move the practice to the deep end of the pool. And to give you some context, I could barely swim. So when I heard that we were moved from 3 to 13-foot pool, it was mind-boggling. And so, the coach asked everybody to get on the block and just jump off. And everybody did, except me. I paused, and I went through my decisions, and I made the executive choice to step down. A bad swimmer like me was just not going to risk his life jumping into the deep end of a pool. Like, my doggy paddles were not going to work in there. But sometimes it's more serious than just jumping off of a swimming block. Sometimes it might be that missed opportunity to pray for somebody that you knew that you were sent to pray for. Or it might be asking that new person in the foyer if they serve or what their name is. And as I was pondering on how to make a move or make the jump, God reminded me of the story of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Now, if you aren't familiar, they were like the 3 musketeers of their time. They were popping, they were lit, and they were heavily slept on, in my opinion, because they were identified as devoted followers of Christ. And at this time, there was a king who wanted everyone to only worship him, and anyone who didn't was thrown in the pits of a furnace. Pretty harsh, isn't it? So we heard about these guys who refused to worship him, and he brings them to the throne. And this is what happens in Daniel chapter 3, verse 16. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego replied to him, "King Nebuchadnezzar, we do not need to defend ourselves before you in this matter. If we are thrown into the blazing furnace, the God we serve is able to deliver us from it, and he will deliver us from your majesty's hand." They straight up just stood their ground. But the king didn't quit either. He threw them in the flames. But thank God the story doesn't end here. They saw God in the flames, and they came out untouched. And when the king saw this miracle, he says in Daniel chapter 3, verses 28 through 30, then Nebuchadnezzar said, "Praise be to the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who has sent his angel and rescued his servants." Wow, talk about a switch up, like he wasn't just trying to throw them into the flames. And so, yes, the king continued. They trusted in him, and they defied the king's command, and they were willing to give up their lives rather than serve or worship any god except their own God. Therefore, I decree that the people of any nation or language who say anything against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego be cut into pieces, and their houses be turned into piles of rubble, for no other God can save in this way. Then the king promoted Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the province of Babylon. The king recognized kingdom through their obedience. And this actually reminds me of a time where I was bold. No water involved this time. Before the school year started, I had a choice to make. Either A, stay dormant, or B, make a change. And this year, me and my sister chose change. After our Pray for Gen Z movement, we were on fire. We were praying to be activated. And so we went straight into that school, and we told the principal about our FCA program, Fellowship Christian Athletes, where we go and pray at the flagpole in the morning in front of everybody. And just 2 weeks ago, we led 25 people in prayer over our school. And I'm not saying this to impress you, but impress upon you how bold courage makes a difference. And you bet our prayers didn't go unanswered. That same night, we received a message from the mother of our very own varsity football starting quarterback saying how thankful she was of our initiative. Because after a win, he gathered his team and they dropped on their knees and prayed. In front of everyone, this teenager gathered his team and prayed in the end zone. When have we ever seen anything like this? Your obedience changes lives. Just look at Hightower. They have Coach Anthony leading his athletes in salvation. They even have a fifth quarter event coming up where after the game, they'll have a whole night of worship in the school gym. So what does this bold obedience look like? Where do you start? First, I'd say next steps, because you can't go anywhere if you don't know your gifts. Maybe you were told to start a small group. Maybe you, as a student, need to invite a friend to youth night. Or maybe you can invite a coworker to Welcome Home Sunday. Serve on the dream team. He has something for everybody. Whatever it is, do something. And if you hear anything I have to say, it's make a move, be bold, and take a chance.
Come on, didn't Chad do such a great job? Well, this morning I'm going to be talking about when you feel like what you have isn't enough. Come on, has anybody ever felt that way before? Like what you have isn't enough for God. Whether it's your time, talent, or treasure, maybe the enemy has made you believe that it's just not enough. I know that I've battled these thoughts, and it's probably safe to say that we all have. And there's a certain story in the Bible that I want to highlight this morning. We can find in 2 Kings chapter 4. And it's the story of the widow's olive oil. It has easily become one of my favorite stories because it shows us that God provides when we obey. And so a little backstory about this story. There's a woman and her husband just died, but he died with the debt that she now owes. And so she's a widow with no money. And back then, the legal system in Israel would make her give her sons as indentured servants to pay off the debt. Now, I don't know about you, but if I'm chilling at home and mom comes up to me and says, "Hey, you're going to have to go work because I can't afford to pay off this debt," mom and I would need to have a little chat. Come on. But can you imagine what the widow probably felt in this moment? She probably felt hopeless, fearful, and worried. And then she met a man named Elisha, who was a prophet. She begins to tell him her problem, and here is what he says in verse 2. He said, "How can I help you? Tell me, what do you have in your house?" And you keep reading, and the widow responds. She says, "Your servant has nothing there at all except a small jar of olive oil." The first thing we notice is this. Number one, we have to recognize what we already have. You see, Elisha asked her, what do you have in your house? And I think that it's so interesting because we often get into this panic or worry mode and when we start to feel overwhelmed because we think that what we have is not enough. But I wonder if there's ever been a moment where we have to stop ourselves and ask, I may not have it all, but what do I have? The next thing I notice is that at first, she said she didn't have anything. And I believe that she paused there for a second because then she realized that she did have something. And it was the small jar of olive oil. She didn't say that at the beginning because I believe that she thought it was insignificant. You see, we often overlook the very thing that God will use to unlock a miracle in our lives because we think that it's not enough. But all God is asking us to do is to obey and to give him what we have. In verse 3 and 4, Elisha gave her some instructions. Elisha said, go around and ask all your neighbors for empty jars. Don't ask for just a few. Then go inside and shut the door behind you and your sons. Pour oil into all the jars, and as each is filled, put it to the side. Now she obeyed. And the story goes on to say that every single jar that she had was filled to the top. But it all started with her small jar of olive oil. And the oil only stopped flowing when there weren't any jars left. You see, she did what she was commanded to do. God made her exercise her faith. And she had to be obedient in what he asked of her. And the result was that she ended up having more than what she started with. You see, she had to be willing, not wishful. She just didn't sit around and hope that things would work out. No, she was willing to put in the work. She was willing to look a little silly to those around her. You see, the miracle was given according to the measure of her faith in borrowing jars and surrendering what she did have. And I remember being 15 years old. I was on fire for God, and I loved what he was doing here at this church. And I was so passionate that I wanted to bring what was happening here to my school. And that year, I felt the Lord tell me to join our FCA club. It's a club of students that meet before school to pray and to lean into God's word. I also heard God tell me that I was going to be a part of starting Fields of Faith at my school. Now, I loved the idea. It sounds really cool. But I was young. I had never put on a big event, and I felt like my voice didn't matter. But I introduced my pastor, Pastor Jim, to my FCA coach, and the one introduction sparked Fields of Faith. You see, God used the little that I had to make a difference. And sure enough, we hosted Fields of Faith that year at my high school, the Needville Football Stadium. Come on. And we saw hundreds of students come together to worship Jesus. But it all started with me being obedient. You see, I had to be willing, not wishful. I had to be willing to put my reputation on the line. I had to be willing to look silly to my so-called friends for being on fire for God. And the result was that we saw a stadium filled with young people that were unashamed of the gospel. And in fact, God is using what I learned then now, because we started an FCA at Terry High School this year. And from the beginning of the school, we have seen students every Wednesday morning come together to worship and to learn and grow in God's word. You see, just like the widow, I gave what I had. It was faith. And God used it. I feel like oftentimes we go to God and we say, God, this is all I have. It's not much. But I feel like God looks down upon his children and he says, my child, that is all I need. He is able to do the much with the little that we have. And maybe you're here today and you say, man, I don't have a lot of time, but I have a little bit of time. Maybe it's your time to join the dream team to make an eternal impact. Or maybe you're saying, man, I don't even know how God has created me. Next Steps is happening today. Because you can't walk in the calling God has asked you to walk in if you don't know how He designed you. Or maybe you've silently wanted to lead a small group, or you're afraid that no one will join, or you're afraid of what people will say about you. I'm telling you, today is your day to walk in what God wants you to walk in. It may be small, but He can do a lot more with small than with nothing. And so my question to you this morning is, are you going to be willing or wishful? Because here's what I know. God provides when we obey. Thank you.